Let me first say I think Joni Mitchell is a genius, but sometimes that label can complicate how we process an artist's legacy. Music critic Ann Powers has spent a long time thinking about Joni. She has a new book out. Today on Commotion, how Joni Mitchell shaped how we talk about music. I'm Alameen Abdul Mahmoud. This is Commotion. All right, I want to start with a song. Here's a bit of All I Want.
I am on a lonely road and I am traveling, looking for something. What can it be? Oh, I hate you some, I love you some.
There are songs that are songs, and there are songs that are like houses. I think you could live in this song. That is All I Want. This is the song that opens Joni Mitchell's most famous album, Blue. The great Ann Powers uses a lyric of the song to frame the title of her new book, Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell, and takes you on this journey through Joni Mitchell's life from her days in Laurel Canyon, roughly documented by the rock and roll gossip rag. This rock and roll gossip rag, Rolling Stone, and also through these albums like Blue and Hajira and Mingus, and right up to her relationship right now with her collaborator, Brandi Carlile. But you should know that Ann chose not to talk to Joni for this biography in order to give herself some distance from Joni and her mythology. And now Ann's here with me to talk about the time that she spent traveling through Joni's life in the 8 years that she spent writing this book. Ann, welcome to the show, friend.
It's so lovely to be here, Elamine. It's a dream. It's fulfilling a dream for me.
It's a dream. It's a dream for me too. I've long been a huge fan of your work. I really appreciate your critical eye and your voice. You know what I think I love most about your music writing is that I think there's like a tenderness and a truth to your approach as a critic. I appreciate the tenderness particularly because a lot of critics seem to think that the job is to point out what's wrong with the song. I think sometimes what I've learned from your writing is you greet the song where it is and you sort of try to suss out where it's trying to get to. Can I just ask you about like how you came to develop, what you look for in music? Because I really admire that about your approach.
Well, thank you so much. That's very insightful. I feel very flattered, but also you really got what I'm trying to do. I've spent most of my writing life in alternative media and alternative newspapers. That's where I started. I've also written for major, the New York Times, LA Times, but my foundation is in alternative media. And I think one of the things about alternative media is that, especially alt news weeklies, when I was coming up, is that we were encouraged to think about who we were in the piece at all times and take chances also, and so the style of writing in which I'm always trying to take my own temperature as it is, not in an egotistical way, but just to recognize, hey, I'm a human. I'm not some kind of authority from above.
Yeah.
The idea of criticism as coming from above doesn't interest me. And coming from the grassroots as I did, that's where I try to write from.
I really love this idea of, kind of associating ourselves with being like, well, we're all a part of, the people who are responding to this music. The idea, you're not just sitting atop some kind of mountain looking down and saying, this is good, this is bad, this is good, this is bad. Because that's how people respond to music too, right? That's how people sort of interact with music. And I guess like with that frame in mind, let's get into Joni,
Yeah.
I do think the place to start, it tends to be Blue. Blue is the capital G Genius album. Blue is the Joni record that everybody refers to. But we should maybe talk about how Blue came to be. So what was Joni working through when she made Blue?
Well, Joni was in a transitional phase when she made Blue. She had been traveling. She was really ensconced in the Laurel Canyon scene, and particularly as a kind of partner, some would say muse. I would like to say potential but never realized member of Crosby, Stills and Nash. She was hanging out with those guys.
Yes.
And Neil Young was around too. But she had been living with Graham Nash. Things were changing. She took a trip, went to Europe, spent some time in Greece, at the same time, she's developing this new relationship with James Taylor. And so the heartbreak in the album is the heartbreak that comes of transition, you know, of knowing you are needing to make a change, and the regret, the pain, the guilt even, but also there is that also the potential. There's so much potential in these songs. And then at the same time, I think she was trying to figure out what her relationship was to being a public figure and being an artist, and particularly how to write songs from the perspective of a woman artist, which she'd always done, but she really started to do her little novels, you know, her little album-length novels with this album.
Album-length novels is a really beautiful description. Because she sort of took the confessional to another level on this album. Maybe I'll come back to that in a second, but let's talk about how the Blue chapter of your book sort of includes a section called "Sad Liberation." What did you find was going on in sort of the wider context of feminism when this album came out?
Yeah, I got that idea from a theorist named Sarah Ahmed, who says that sadness can be a form of resistance, but it's a complicated form of resistance and an incomplete one, almost like an inchoate one. And what I recognize is a relationship between Blue, the Joni of Blue, and the kinds of novels that were being written by women like Margaret Atwood, for example, Erica Jong. Fear of Flying is less sad, but you know, just this, and also other texts that were coming forward in women's liberation, and even before that, Joan Didion's novel "Play It As It Lays," which I wouldn't call a feminist novel exactly, but sort of a proto-feminist story.
Yeah.
And the idea that sadness is a way. It's a form of self-possession, you know. It's even if it doesn't, it doesn't take you maybe where you need to go. It pulls you back from where you're stuck, and that's what I hear in Blue. It is a way of saying no, you know, and maybe a way of saying no that's not so healthy for the woman. But as women's liberation developed from the feminine mystique, Betty Friedan, through toward what it became in the 70s and fighting for things like the ERA, there was this period where women had to say, you know what, I'm dissatisfied. There's something on my shoulders and I don't know how to get it off. And that's what I hear on Blue, you know?
Well, I'm interested in that because it's quite a contrast to the way that album was received. I mean, like Joni says that Chris Christopherson responded to Blue by saying, "Oh, Joni, save something for yourself." Can you talk about that attitude? That's an interesting attitude, like this idea that, like, you know what, this is too confessional in a sense.
Well, it's kind of funny, Ellie, because I don't think anybody was saying, "Hey, Bob Dylan," that is, "save something for yourself," when he was literally describing his songwriting as a form of vomiting, or "Hey, Lenny, save something for yourself," when he was writing, Leonard Cohen, of course, the great Canadian bard, when he was writing his very explicit songs, you know, and taking us into his earthly garden of delights or whatever. So some of it was male discomfort at a woman expressing her dissatisfaction, you know, but at the same time, I also think we should recognize it's not just about gender, because this was a moment when we were moving from the folk revival on the one hand and pop music, rock and roll, the Beatles on the other hand, where the intimacy of songwriting and the personal quality of these songs was what did feel new, you know, and it wasn't that long between when John Lennon wrote Norwegian Wood, one of the great confessional songs or, you know, personal songs, to when Joni writes Blue. And songs were like, "Hey baby, I love you," you know, or they were cosmic, you know, "Let's look at the stars because we're on acid." But this bearing your heart thing, that was kind of new in popular music.
Yeah. And what a legacy it has sort of begat, you know, just like from that particular starting point. I'm going to come back to that legacy in just a second. But before we go forward, let's go back in time, because it would be useful, I think, to situate people in Laurel Canyon. Like, this is a famous neighborhood in Hollywood Hills. A lot of major musicians of the 60s live there. They party there. Joni is part of this boys club that you mentioned. So we're talking about not just Nash, but also Crosby, Stills. Joni was not close with a lot of other women. Why do you think she gravitated towards this kind of boys club?
survival in some ways,
Hmm.
and a recognition of her own ambition. There were other significant women in the Laurel Canyon scene. Carole King, for example,
Yeah.
obviously Cass Elliot, whose home was sort of the epicenter of that scene. Judy Sill, someone who now there's a great new documentary about. But these women they used different strategies, some of them not that successful, to make a place for themselves.
Yeah.
Cass Elliot, she talked about, hey, I'm always willing to put out a spread and welcome people and be the hostess with the mostest. Joni didn't want to make any sandwiches. She wasn't going to spend time doing that. Actually,
Yeah.
there's a great story that Cass Elliot told about how one time they were having Christmas dinner at her house and Joni wouldn't sit at the table. She was off writing a song. So
Right.
her strategy was to constantly foreground herself as an artist.
Right.
I am an artist. I am worthy as any man in this circle. And I'm not going to interrupt my process
Hmm.
in order to bring you comfort, David Crosby, or whatever. So
Yeah.
I think she learned how to do this very young. She describes herself as a tomboy as a child and preferring to play with boys. She learned how to code switch a bit. And
Hmm.
even though she was in many ways very feminine, her persona was very feminine, she also had this androgynous side or this code switching side in which she could just kind of turn that not exactly off, but modulate it so she could be recognized as an equal.
Yeah, step into a different kind of modality, if you will. Like, listen,
Exactly.
you describe Joni as a quote, flat out mean girl at times, on her record Ladies of the Canyon. Why don't we listen to a bit of that song?
For her home she gathers flowers, and a stray dear companion colors up the sunshine hours, pouring music down the canyon.
And in the book, you contrast this song with the self-portrait, Joni's self-portrait song, Cactus Tree. What do you read? What are you reading in these two songs against each other?
Well, Cactus Tree is a story of someone in motion, someone refusing to be pinned down, and someone so alluring that even as she walks out of the picture, the men she's entranced are still have her image burned into their minds and their eyes.
Yeah.
Whereas Ladies of the Canyon, the women she talks about or sings about in that song, even though on the surface and even slightly below the surface, it's a very admiring portrait of these women. It's still, well, you heard it. It's a bit Disney princess, let's just say. And these women were artists themselves,
Yeah.
and yet the way the song describes them is that they are unrealized. They're kind of stuck in the private realm.
Yeah.
What I hear is a bit of, well, yeah, you're beautiful and all, but I'm the one writing this song. I'm the one who's going to tell your story. So nobody's telling the story of the woman in Cactus Tree except for that woman.
No, there's that thread of self-possession again. Hey, there's that
Absolutely.
what I appreciated is that you spent quite a bit of time with a chapter in Joni's career that maybe a lot of people don't want to talk about, don't want to think about, question mark. I'll give the context here, which is that Joni started experimenting with jazz in the 70s. She was really influenced by Bitches Brew, the Miles Davis record. But this is where maybe the most disturbing part of Joni's career starts to surface. I know you struggled to write about Art Nouveau. Can you explain who Art is?
Art is Joni's muse and self-created inner self,
Mm-hmm.
That's a weird way to say it. But basically, she long had said she lived for her art and art was her companion. Well, Joni loves wordplay, and eventually art with a small a becomes art, a person.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how it happened. In the mid-70s, Leland Sklar, the bass player, was having a Halloween party, and Joni didn't have a costume. So she was walking down the road in Hollywood, I think Hollywood Boulevard maybe, and walks by a man who kind of, gives her a like, hey, sister, you looking good thing. And he's a black man. And she claimed to have felt his spirit kind of enter her, or she felt inspired by him.
Mm-hmm.
Went into a costume shop, figured I'm going to dress like this man. And that included brown makeup that she applied to her face.
Yeah.
So she bought an Afro wig, she bought a fedora. And I've been saying she looked like the kind of a black man who was on the cover of Miles Davis's album On the Corner. You know, let's just say someone who would be hanging out
Yeah.
on the corner in the mid 70s. And the legend, which I find completely unbelievable, is that no one at this party recognized her.
Right.
She was so convincing in this costume. That's how she told it. Okay, one costume, that's still a terrible error, and there is a photograph documenting it. However, she didn't leave it at that. She
No.
was so delighted in her charade that she then donned the costume again for the cover of her album Don Juan's Reckless Daughter, on which she also, by the way, appears on the back cover with her head superimposed on the body of a First Nations person in full regalia. So
Mhm.
she's definitely playing with fire, the fire of identity here.
Yeah.
Art Nouveau appears again briefly in the concert film Shadows and Light, and then in a short film she made called The Black Cat with the White Mouse. I always get this wrong. Anyway, it's the cat with the white mouse socks, and
Yeah.
you can find it on YouTube. So she keeps this figure alive.
Right.
No one around her questions her. Very few critics even question her. And although Art Nouveau's costume is retired, she continued to talk about her connection with black men, how she was somehow inhabited.
Like partly
By-
spiritually, yes.
Yes. And even going so far as to say in a much later interview that a dentist had told her she had the teeth of a
Oh, wow.
black man. So she, this is something that people have confronted, but usually just say, "Oh, it was the times," it was,
Yeah.
many people were doing this. In my chapter, I just try to say we need to face this head on and face the fact that our heroes, and someone who actually collaborated with many black musicians, was, quite a champion of making music across racial and every line.
Yeah.
That she felt she could do this.
I mean, I was going to say, like, Joni has sort of traditionally had, like, in terms of the collaborators that she has in terms of her band, she has so many black musicians that she's worked with for such a long time.
Yeah.
She's deeply close friends with Herbie Hancock. I mean, like, the story of how black artists have influenced Joni's life, like, that's not a secret at all. But then you
Right.
kind of get to this chapter, and it's a chapter that I think maybe because of the discomfort, people would like to, skip over or like acknowledge, but
Yes.
then kind of move on quickly from it. But you sort of talked about how difficult and strange this chapter was to write for, as you were sort of trying to work through this. You spoke with a professor named Miles Greer about facing this part of her history. What did he say that helped you write this chapter?
Well, I had read a piece that Miles had written years before. He was the first scholar who alerted me to this because,
Yeah.
it's amazing, Ellen. I mean, people don't know about this chapter in her life. It's
I
every
didn't.
time
I didn't till I read your
Isn't
book.
that crazy?
Yeah.
It's so wild. I mean,
Yeah.
it was right there in plain sight, and
Yeah.
and yet people don't know. So I saw Miles present this paper, which you can find online, and his thoughts on both her motivations and how that sits in the world were
Yeah.
really definitive. And I didn't want to just paraphrase him. I wanted to try to have a dialogue. And when we spoke, one thing I said was, "Hey, look, I'm trying to check my own white privilege. And, I recognize even this conversation is, in a sense, me, risking airing my white privilege again." So he kept pulling me back from that. And I mean, one important point that he makes is, well, two important points he makes. One, and other scholars have made this point too, but is that Joni was kind of showing up her white male companions and saying, "Look, you're putting me in the position, a marginalized position, similar to black men, but also, I mean, this is an interesting way to think about it. Also, I'm feeling objectified. I'm feeling like I kind of have to pimp myself, as it were,
Sure.
to really be realized as an artist. And by inhabiting this costume, I'm showing that in a really almost like cartoonish way. So that's one thing. But another thing that Miles said that I think is so important is that really what matters isn't this symbolic transgression. That does matter, and we have to talk about it. But ultimately, he wanted me to think about who is doing material work and helping people materially? You know, who is actually uplifting Black collaborators in that space? And he says Joni was.
Yeah.
But let's talk about Bonnie Raitt, you know, who supported people like Ruth Brown. You know, let's talk about some of these other artists who were really in there and making sure that the economics were fair. So I just wanted to have this dialogue, both to not foreground my voice, but to show that we can only move forward in dialogue across these lines, and also just because he has such great insights.
This is totally completely an aside, but anytime you want to talk about Bonnie Raitt, this is an absolutely welcome space for you to talk about Bonnie Raitt anytime. Listen, we've talked about how Joni didn't have many closer relationships with other women. And then you get the 90s and a wave of young singers. We're talking about like anyone from Alanis Morissette to Sarah McLachlan. They all claim her. They claim her as an influence. They claim her as a North Star. You know, these days she's worked closely with Brandi Carlile. You know, you called Joni their spiritual mother. Can you just tell me a little bit about this evolution from Laurel Canyon mean girl into like a mother figure for these young artists? How do we get there?
I think it's important to note, even though, you know, I was just saying, as far as the Art Nouveau thing goes, I don't ever want to hear anybody say, oh, it was just the times. I don't think we can excuse that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I spent a lot of my life really frustrated with Joni and her generation in general for rejecting what I viewed as the central sort of feminist move in popular music, which is to create community with other women. I am going to use the phrase, it was the times. In my research, I discovered that few to no women who were having success commercially at that time would claim the term feminist or would openly express solidarity with women. In the late 60s, I think, feminism was viewed, the women's movement was viewed as an almost separatist thing. And in fact, you know, certain great women artists like June Millington, for example, or Chris Williamson did create women's music, you know, that was separatist music. So I think that it was a survival strategy, one that she could have spoken out against, but I get why she didn't at that time. Also, the code switching I was talking about, I just feel like she didn't see that much value in art that was coded feminine, you know, even though we listen to these early records and they're all lacy and, you know, pink, but by the 70s, her sound is much cooler. She's making, and even her voice, even though it's just still that high register, it feels kind of androgynous. She's often inhabiting male characters. Now, by the time, we'll skip over the 80s for now, but by the time, the great era, one of my favorites, but by the time we get to the 90s, some things have changed in her personal life. An important thing is that Joni had entrusted a daughter in adoption when she was 21 years old.
Yeah, and, she wrote Little Green about that. Yeah.
Yes, Kelly Dale. And Kelly Dale, who was Kaloran, named that by her adoptive parents, found her in the 90s. So suddenly, and very publicly, suddenly, Joni was a mother in the eyes of, and literally also a grandmother in that same moment. Oh, wow. So, because Kaloran had a boy at that time, now it's two. Anyway, so she was reintegrating her mother self. And even though she resisted like going on Lilith Fair, and she didn't have a lot of great things to say maybe about some of the artists of that time, she did open herself up to being that figure. Though there was a Walden Woods benefit that was that Don Henley put on in the late 90s, and she sings a duet with Bjork in that. And, you know, she's making her choices. If she's going to be a mother at that time, she's going to be a mother to the coolest, the coolest daughters. Yes. Now, So anyway, we can talk about the Brandi moment, but that's kind of a separate moment too.
Yeah, listen, for now, I got to pause it there because we got to say goodbye to our radio audience. So if you're listening on the radio, thank you so much for joining us. This show is called Commotion, and my guest today has been Ann Powers. We've been talking about her incredible new book, Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell. I'm so deeply grateful for the existence of this book. There's going to be more of this conversation on our podcast, so find us wherever you get your podcasts. In the meantime, my name is Alamin Abdul Mahmoud. This show is called Commotion, and we'll see you on the radio tomorrow.